In 1889, a grieving Victorian family laid their lifeless baby upon silk cushions, dressed him in his finest gown, and invited a photographer to capture what seemed like gentle sleep. But what they preserved was no ordinary memory. It became one of the most unsettling images of its time. Was this photo merely a mourning relic, or something far darker? Before we dive into today's tale, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and hit that bell icon so you never miss a story like this. And share your thoughts in the comments. The year was 1889, deep within the Victorian era, when the shadow of death lingered over nearly every household in England. Streets were choked with soot from factories, fog rolled heavy across gaslit alleys, and the tolling of church bells for yet another funeral was a sound the living had grown accustomed to. Life expectancy was short, especially for children, and every family carried the weight of grief. It was a society obsessed with mourning, where the boundary between life and death felt as fragile as a candle flame in the wind. Victorians approached death not with silence, but with ritual. Mourning customs ruled the social order. Widows dressed in black crepe for years. Jewelry was fashioned from the braided hair of the departed, and parlors were hung with heavy curtains to symbolize sorrow. Families believed grief must be displayed outwardly, not hidden. Even the smallest details carried meaning. The cut of a dress, the veil's length, the flowers placed upon a grave. To show too little mourning was seen as scandalous, even disrespectful. But there was another custom, one even more intimate and haunting, the practice of post-mortem photography. At a time when cameras were rare and expensive, few families ever had the chance to sit for a portrait while alive. Children especially often passed before a photograph could be taken. So when death came, parents turned to photographers to preserve what life had stolen. The dead were dressed in their finest, posed to appear at rest, sometimes even arranged among their siblings, as if still part of the family circle. These portraits were not seen as grotesque, but as acts of love, a way to keep the memory alive forever. The technology of photography itself contributed to the eeriness. Exposures were long, requiring stillness. For the living, this meant stiff, unsmiling faces. For the dead, it meant something uncanny. Their unnatural stillness made them seem the most lifelike of all. To enhance the illusion, photographers would paint pupils on closed eyelids, tint lips to restore color, or pose bodies upright with hidden stands. To modern eyes, the result is chilling. But in 1889, it was grief crystallized into an image, a permanent vigil against forgetting. Still, not all approved. Religious leaders argued such practices bordered on idolatry, preserving the body in ways that interfered with spiritual release. Neighbors whispered that photographs trapped the soul, binding it to the earthly realm. Yet others clung to them desperately, believing the captured image provided comfort, that their child or spouse had not vanished entirely, that they remained visible, tangible. In parlors across England, framed post-mortem photographs sat openly on mantels beside living portraits. As if death had not interrupted family life at all. This was the cultural landscape into which our story unfolds. A world where death was omnipresent, where superstition mingled with science, and where sorrow sought expression in rituals both beautiful and unsettling. It is against this backdrop that one grieving family, in the year 1889, chose to preserve their baby in death. Their decision was not unusual by Victorian standards, but the photograph that resulted its chilling aura, its whispered legacy, would become something far more than a token of remembrance. Began as an act of love, soon gave rise to suspicion, fear, and a mystery that refuses to fade even over a century later. For within the frozen gaze of that small, lifeless child, many believed they saw something no photograph should ever hold. The family at the center of this story lived not in the bustling streets of London, but in the quieter, industrial town of Leeds, England, where smoke from the mills hung heavy and the lives of working-class families were ruled by factory bells. They were not wealthy, but they were respectable, known to neighbors as a family who worked hard, worshipped faithfully, and endured their share of hardships with stoic silence. The father, Thomas Whitfield, was a man of 35 who had labored since boyhood in the textile mills. His hands were rough, his back bent from long hours at the looms, but his wages kept bread on the table and coal in the fireplace. To his co-workers, he was quiet, a man who carried grief close but rarely spoke of it. To his children, he was stern yet dependable, a presence as steady as the factory whistle that marked each day. The mother, Eleanor Whitfield, was 28, delicate in frame, yet possessed of a resilience that surprised many. She had already borne 4 children, though only 2 survived infancy. This was not unusual in 1889. Infant mortality was cruelly high, but for Eleanor, each loss carved a wound deeper than the last. Her faith gave her strength, but her heart carried shadows that even prayer could not always lift. She was known in the parish as a gentlewoman, devoted to her children, often seen carrying them bundled in blankets through the cold, soot-stained streets. The baby Samuel Whitfield was born frail from the start. His cries were weak, his breathing shallow, and neighbors who visited offered both congratulations and condolences in the same breath. Eleanor, however, clung fiercely to hope. She rocked him for hours, whispered hymns into his tiny ear, and refused to let despair take root. Thomas, ever the realist, feared the worst but never voiced it aloud. He had buried too many children already. He would not steal hope from his wife. The Whitfields' home was modest, 2 cramped rooms above a cooper shop, furnished with little more than a wooden table, a Bible, and a cradle that had rocked each of their children in turn. Coal dust seeped through the cracks, damp crept up the walls, yet Eleanor kept the place spotless. A single-framed photograph hung on the wall, the only one they had ever afforded, showing Thomas in his Sunday coat, taken before their wedding. No image of Eleanor, nor of their living children, existed. For them, the cost of photography was too great, reserved for the wealthy or for rare, solemn occasions. That scarcity explains why, when Samuel grew sickly and his tiny body failed to thrive, Eleanor made a desperate promise. If he did not live, she would see that his likeness endured. She could not bear another child, vanishing without trace, remembered only in fading memory. Thomas resisted at first. What sense was there in spending their meager savings on such a thing? But Eleanor's resolve was unshakable. "If God takes him," she whispered, "we must keep something of him. We cannot let him disappear." The family's faith played its part as well. Their parish priest preached often about the fleeting nature of life, reminding his congregation that the soul departed swiftly, leaving only the husk of the body. Yet Eleanor believed the photograph would capture not just Samuel's likeness, but his presence, the way his small hands curled, the softness of his hair, the innocence in his sleeping face. She saw no sin in it, only love. Their neighbors had opinions of their own. Some sympathized, having themselves lost children to influenza, cholera, or simple malnutrition. Others whispered that such photographs were unsettling, that they blurred the line between the living and the dead. A local midwife remarked that she had seen families clutch such images as if they were charms, refusing to move on, clinging dangerously to grief. But Eleanor paid no mind. Samuel was her child, and whether he lived or died, she would not let him fade into silence. In the final weeks of Samuel's life, the household grew quieter still. Eleanor barely left the child's side, rocking him long into the night, her own health waning under the strain. Thomas worked extra shifts, as if exhausting his body might keep grief at bay. Their older children tiptoed around the cradle, their games hushed, their eyes wide with the awareness that something unspeakable hovered in the air. Then, on a cold November morning, Samuel's breathing slowed, faltered, and ceased. The small form lay still in Eleanor's arms, his face peaceful, as if merely drifting into sleep. She wept until her strength failed, clutching him to her chest, as though warmth alone might call him back. Thomas, who had braced for this moment, stood silent, his jaw set in a grim line. He had no words for his wife's grief, nor for his own. True to her vow, Eleanor insisted they send for a photographer. Neighbors were startled, some scandalized, that she would so quickly arrange for such a thing. But she explained with calm resolve that this was her last chance to hold her child in memory. She would not let him vanish like the others, unseen and unremembered. And so, with borrowed coins and a mother's unyielding love, the Whitfields prepared to preserve Samuel, not in life, but in death. On the morning following Samuel's death, Eleanor Whitfield kept her vigil. She sat in the dim parlor, the child's body wrapped in his christening gown, her hand stroking his pale cheek as though he still lived. Outside, factory whistles shrieked. Life in Leeds marched on, but inside that cramped room, time seemed frozen. Thomas, though weary and reluctant, had done as his wife asked. He had summoned a photographer. By midday, the man arrived. His name was Mr. Alistair Green, a traveling photographer known in several towns for his willingness to perform post-mortem portraits. He carried with him a heavy wooden camera, its bellows creaking, a tripod, and a black cloth for focusing. His manner was quiet, professional, almost clinical. For Green, this was work, yet he never mocked the grief of his clients. He knew that for many families, this photograph would be the only image they ever owned of their child. The Whitfields welcomed him into their parlor, where the air was thick with coal smoke and sorrow. Green removed his hat, nodded respectfully, and asked softly, "Shall I see the boy?" Eleanor rose with trembling arms and revealed Samuel's tiny face. The photographer gave no gasp of revulsion, no judgment, only a slow nod. "We will make him look as though he rests in peace," he said. The work began with preparation. Eleanor fetched Samuel's best gown, a lace-trimmed garment she had kept aside for special occasions. She smoothed it over the child's still form, arranging the fabric so no crease marred its appearance. She combed his fine hair with a trembling hand, whispering lullabies under her breath. Thomas stood silent, his jaw clenched, his hands clasped behind his back. His grief took the shape of restraint. Eleanor's flowed freely, spilling into every gesture. Green arranged the scene with practiced precision. A high-backed chair was pulled near the window where thin light fell. The baby was placed upon a small cushion, his body supported by hidden stands. Green adjusted his pose delicately, tilting the chin upward, arranging the arms to lie gently across the chest. Eleanor could not watch. She pressed a handkerchief to her mouth and turned away. The most unsettling work was yet to come. Samuel's eyelids, closed in death, gave the impression of sleep, but in the Victorian tradition, families often desired something more lifelike. Green carried small brushes and pigments. With faint strokes, he tinted the cheeks to restore a hint of color. Then, with steady hands, he painted the suggestion of pupils upon the lids. From a distance, it gave the illusion that Samuel's eyes were faintly open, gazing somewhere beyond. Eleanor wept when she saw it, for in that moment, the child appeared not entirely gone. The photographer stepped back, draped the black cloth over his head, and peered into the camera's ground glass. He adjusted the lens, shifted the tripod, and instructed the parents to hold still. "One exposure will suffice," he murmured. "But you must not move." Thomas and Eleanor were asked to sit beside their son, their faces turned solemnly toward the camera. Green explained that any smile or softening of grief would appear unnatural. Mourning portraits were not meant to deceive. They were meant to endure. The Whitfields posed as instructed, Eleanor's hand resting near Samuel's cushion, Thomas's eyes fixed straight ahead. The room fell into silence. Green counted softly under his breath as the exposure began. The seconds dragged, heavy and suffocating. The ticking of the mantel clock grew thunderous in Eleanor's ears. Her body ached to weep, but she forced herself into stillness. In those long moments, she felt as though her son were alive again. His presence tethered to her by the camera's unblinking eye dot at last, Green lifted the lens cap and declared it done. He moved with brisk efficiency, packing his chemicals and plates. "The image will be ready in a week's time," he told them. "I shall bring it here myself." But the act itself had left its mark. Eleanor could not shake the eerie feeling that something of Samuel lingered, caught not only on glass, but within the very room. She swore she felt a breath of cold pass by her ear as the photographer worked. Thomas dismissed it, insisting it was only her grief speaking. Yet when he glanced at the child one last time, a shiver rippled through his spine. As Green gathered his equipment, he offered a final reassurance. "You have done what many parents must. You will not regret it. His likeness will remain, even when memory fades." He bowed his head and departed, leaving the Whitfields alone once more. The parlor felt strangely empty without the camera, as though the space itself had been disturbed. The cushion still held the impression of Samuel's form, his painted eyes staring faintly into nothingness. Eleanor cradled him again, whispering, "You will be remembered, my darling, always." To the Whitfields, the photograph was meant as comfort. But in the days that followed, whispers began to stir. Neighbors who had seen Green enter their home muttered that such work was unnatural, that capturing the dead invited spirits to linger. Some claimed they saw lights flicker in the Whitfield window at night, others that the photograph itself might hold more than an image. For Eleanor, however, none of this mattered. She awaited the return of Green with trembling anticipation. To her, the coming photograph was not a relic of death, but proof that her child had existed, that he had not slipped into oblivion unseen. She believed that once she held the likeness in her hands, she would finally find a measure of peace. But what the Whitfields would soon receive was far more than a token of memory. The image would not soothe. It would disturb, unsettle, and carry a legacy that echoed long after 1889. When Mr. Green returned a week later, true to his promise, he placed the finished photograph gently into Eleanor's trembling hands. The image was hauntingly beautiful, yet undeniably eerie. Samuel lay upon his lace cushion, his small body still, his cheeks faintly rosy, his eyes seemingly open, though no life stirred behind them. To Eleanor, the likeness was everything she had hoped for, a proof that her son had not simply vanished, that his memory could endure in the form of this solemn portrait. She framed the photograph and set it upon the mantel, beside the family Bible. Each evening, she lit a candle near it, whispering prayers that her son's soul had reached heaven. To her, the image brought comfort. To Thomas, it brought unease. He did not speak of it, but each time his eyes strayed toward the portrait, he felt an inexplicable chill creep through him. It was not long before neighbors came to call, some offering condolences, others out of curiosity. Word had spread that the Whitfields had commissioned a post-mortem portrait, and in the close-knit streets of Leeds, such a thing quickly became the subject of whispers. Those who were welcomed into the parlor and allowed to see the photograph reacted in divided ways. Some wept quietly, touched by the tenderness of the image. Others turned pale, muttering that the baby's painted eyes seemed to follow them, that the likeness was too real. Rumors soon took on a life of their own. One neighbor insisted she had seen Samuel's tiny chest rise and fall in the photograph, as though the child were breathing. Another swore that when she glanced at the portrait a second time, the baby's mouth had shifted, curling into the faintest of smiles. Such claims spread rapidly, fueled by the Victorian fascination with spiritualism, a movement that blended grief with a desire to contact the dead. Seances, ghost photography, and tales of lingering spirits were already popular in England. To many, the Whitfields' photograph became more than a family relic. It was a window into the unknown. The parish priest was less forgiving. From the pulpit he warned that to preserve the dead in such fashion was to meddle with divine will. Let the body return to dust, he thundered, and the soul to God. To hold on too tightly is to risk binding the spirit to this world. Though he never named the Whitfields directly, all in the congregation knew to whom he referred. Eleanor left the church that Sunday with tears stinging her eyes, clutching Samuel's older child by the hand, refusing to look at her neighbors. Thomas, meanwhile, bore the burden of gossip at the mills. Co-workers nudged one another, whispering that he had allowed his wife to invite corruption into their home. Some claimed the Whitfield house was cursed, that late at night, shadows were seen flitting across the upstairs window when no lamp was lit. A few even said they heard the sound of an infant crying faintly in the alley that ran behind the house. For Eleanor, such talk only deepened her resolve. She insisted to all who would listen that the photograph was an act of love, not sin. He was mine, she told one skeptical neighbor, and he will not be forgotten. Yet privately, she too began to sense unease. One evening, as she trimmed the candle near the portrait, she thought she saw Samuel's painted eyes glisten, reflecting light where none should have been. Another night, as she passed through the parlor, she swore she heard a whisper soft, almost indistinct, calling her name. The older children felt it as well. Her daughter claimed she dreamed of Samuel sitting upright in the cradle, staring silently. Her son, barely 6, refused to sleep in the adjoining room, saying he heard his baby brother laughing in the night. Thomas dismissed these fears at first, but when he himself was woken by the sound of a muffled cry in the darkness, his skepticism wavered. He searched the house in vain, yet the sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The photograph became both shrine and specter within their home. Eleanor prayed before it daily, whispering hymns through her tears. Thomas avoided its gaze, turning his chair so he did not have to see it. Visitors stopped coming altogether, repelled by the growing rumors that the Whitfield household harbored something unnatural. In time, the gossip grew darker still. Some said the Whitfields had staged the death, that Samuel had been alive when the photograph was taken and had perished only afterward. Others claimed the photographer himself had drawn the child's soul into the glass plate, a common superstition of the era. Children in the neighborhood dared each other to creep past the Whitfield house at night, certain they would glimpse a pale infant's face at the window. The weight of these whispers bore down heavily on the family. Eleanor clung more desperately to the image, insisting that love had sanctified it. Thomas, however, grew restless, troubled not only by rumor, but by a gnawing sense that the photograph had indeed captured something more than mere likeness. What was meant to be a comfort was turning into a curse. And in the months that followed, as grief refused to fade and the portrait seemed to gather an aura of dread, the Whitfields would find themselves confronting not only their neighbor's suspicion, but their own deepest fears. For if the photograph was merely an image, why did it feel so alive? By the spring of 1890, the Whitfield household was no longer simply a place of mourning. It had become a place of unease, where shadows seemed to stretch too long across the walls, and silence carried whispers that no one wanted to admit hearing. The photograph of Samuel remained on the mantel, its frame polished daily by Eleanor, its glass cleaned as if it were a holy relic. Yet even she, who clung most desperately to it, could not deny the heaviness that now pressed upon the house. At first, it was subtle. The sound of a soft cry drifting down the hallway, only to fade when the door was opened. A faint tapping against the window when no branch was near. The smell of milk souring in the air, though no pitcher had been left out. Thomas tried to dismiss these things as tricks of the mind, the natural outcome of grief. But each night, as he sat by the dying firelight, He could not escape the feeling that something was watching. Eleanor, meanwhile, grew thinner, paler. She spent long hours sitting before the portrait, whispering lullabies to it as though Samuel might still hear her. Sometimes she even rocked gently in her chair, cradling her empty arms as if the child lay within them. Neighbors began to mutter that her sorrow had driven her to madness. Yet when confronted, she insisted that Samuel's presence was real. "He is with us still," she whispered to Thomas one night. "The photograph keeps him near." Their older children began to fear the parlor entirely. Their daughter refused to pass by the mantel, saying Samuel's painted eyes seemed to follow her across the room. Their son, once a cheerful boy, now woke screaming from nightmares in which the baby's cold hands reached for his throat. Thomas, torn between protecting his children and respecting Eleanor's grief, found himself caught in a silent war. He began to avoid home whenever possible, lingering at the mills until long after the whistle blew, reluctant to return to the oppressive atmosphere of his own house. The breaking point came on a night in May. A storm rattled the windows. Lightning flashed across the soot-darkened sky, and thunder rolled through the narrow streets. The Whitfields huddled together in the parlor when suddenly, with a sharp crack, the glass covering Samuel's portraits split from corner to corner. Eleanor screamed, clutching the frame to her chest as though her child had been harmed anew. Thomas snatched it away, furious, shouting that the photograph had cursed them, that it had brought nothing but misery. In his rage, he nearly cast the portrait into the fire. But Eleanor's shriek stopped him cold. She flung herself before the hearth, sobbing, begging him not to destroy the only image of their son. Her desperation was so fierce, so wild, that Thomas faltered. His anger drained into dread as he looked into her eyes and realized she no longer clung to memory alone. She clung to the photograph as though it contained Samuel's very soul. From that night forward, the rift between them widened. Thomas could not bear the sight of the photograph, while Eleanor treated it as a sacred object. She lit candles around it, prayed before it, even set small offerings of flowers beside the frame. The children avoided the parlor entirely, leaving their mother alone in her vigil. Thomas, unable to banish the sense of dread, began sleeping in the mill dormitories, telling himself it was only for convenience. In truth, he feared what lingered within his own home. Whispers outside grew louder. Neighbors claimed to see flickering lights in the Whitfield windows long after midnight. Some swore they heard an infant's laughter drifting down the alleyway, though Samuel had been dead for months. The parish priest confronted Thomas, urging him to destroy the photograph, warning that the devil used grief as a doorway. Thomas, though shaken, could not bring himself to act. He feared Eleanor would shatter completely if he took the image from her, yet the unease grew unbearable. On a damp June morning, Thomas found Eleanor slumped in her chair before the portrait, eyes half closed, lips moving in a whisper. He bent close and realized she was crooning to Samuel, as though answering a voice only she could hear. He shook her, demanding she come to her senses, but she merely smiled faintly and murmured, "He called to me, Thomas. Our boy still lives in this house." That was when Thomas finally understood. The photograph had not given Eleanor comfort. It had imprisoned her in grief, tethering her heart to a shadow of what once was. Worse still, he could not shake the suspicion that something beyond grief lurked in that image, something that fed on her devotion, that drew strength from her belief. In the weeks that followed, the Whitfield home stood quieter than ever, avoided by neighbors, whispered about in the mills, pitied in church pews. The family had become an island, set apart by sorrow and suspicion. The photograph remained at the center of it all, a relic meant to preserve memory, but which had instead deepened loss, widened rifts, and drawn fear into every corner of their lives. The breaking point had come, but the aftermath was only beginning. For the Whitfields were no longer simply a grieving family. They were a cautionary tale whispered in alleyways, a reminder of how thin the line could be between love and obsession, between remembrance and haunting. And the photograph once meant as comfort now carried with it a reputation far darker than any parent could have foreseen. Decades passed, and the Whitfield name gradually slipped into obscurity. By the turn of the century, Thomas had died of lung sickness from years in the mills, while Eleanor faded away not long after, her last days spent in the parlor whispering to a photograph no one else dared to touch. Their children grew, married, and moved from Leeds, carrying with them the shadows of their childhood, but leaving behind the cramped, sorrow-filled rooms of their youth. For years, the house sat neglected, the windows dark, the walls peeling with damp. It was during a demolition in the 1920s that workmen discovered the photograph of Samuel, still framed, still perched on the cracked mantel, its glass mended crudely with strips of paper. Dust clung thick to its edges, but the child's face remained unervingly clear, eyes painted open, cheeks faintly rosy, as if time itself had refused to dim his likeness. One laborer swore the boy's gaze shifted as he carried the frame outside. Another refused to touch it at all, muttering a prayer beneath his breath. The photograph eventually found its way into the hands of an antique dealer, who recognized the Victorian mourning style and placed it in his shop window. Customers paused uneasily when they passed, some drawn in by the tragic beauty, others repelled by its unsettling aura. Word spread quickly through Leeds. The sleeping boy of 1889 had resurfaced. Local papers even ran short articles about the discovery, spinning the tale of the Whitfields and their grief into a Gothic curiosity. Historians and collectors argued fiercely over the photograph's significance. To some, it was a simple relic of a bygone era, an example of the widespread practice of post-mortem photography. To others, it was an object of folklore, surrounded by too many strange rumors to dismiss. Researchers noted the cracked glass, the whispered accounts of crying in the Whitfield home, the mother's alleged obsession with the portrait. They asked, had grief alone fueled those stories, or had the photograph itself invited something darker? By mid-century, the portrait changed hands several times, each owner adding to its mystique. One collector claimed his house grew cold each night the photograph was displayed. Another swore he heard faint tapping against the frame while writing in his study. A museum briefly exhibited it in the 1960s under the title Victorian Mourning Traditions, but removed it after visitors reported headaches, sudden chills, and one child fainting directly before the glass. The photograph was returned quietly to storage, its reputation too troublesome for polite scholarship. Meanwhile, stories of the Whitfield family resurfaced in unexpected places. Folklorists collected accounts from elderly Leeds residents who remembered their parents warning them not to pass the Whitfield house at night. Some swore they saw a candle flickering long after the house was abandoned, others that they heard the faint wail of an infant drifting through the alleyways. Though decades had passed, the legend of the baby who slept in death lived on, whispered as a cautionary tale about grief taken too far in recent years. As interest in the macabre grew, the photograph found new audiences. Scans of the image circulated online, sparking heated debates on forums dedicated to the paranormal. Some insisted it was simply an artifact of Victorian culture, eerie only because modern sensibilities no longer understood the closeness of death in that age. Others claimed anomalies could be seen when the image was magnified, faint shadows around the child's mouth, a glimmer in the painted eyes that seemed too real. A few swore that digital copies of the photograph corrupted their devices, as though Samuel himself resisted reproduction. Academics remained divided. Photographic experts confirmed the techniques used pigments on the eyelids. Tinted cheeks were common in the 1880s, but folklorists argue that the sheer persistence of supernatural claims surrounding the Whitfield portrait cannot be ignored. It is not merely the photograph itself, They suggest that the emotional weight of the story, a grieving mother, a father unraveling, a family fractured by sorrow. Perhaps it is this intensity of love and loss that imbued the image with power, lingering long after the subjects themselves had turned to dust. Today, the original photograph's whereabouts are uncertain. Some say it remains locked in a private collection in London, shielded from the public eye. Others believe it was destroyed in a fire during the 1980s, though no proof has surfaced. What is certain is that the legend of Samuel Whitfield endures. Each retelling adds new layers, some embellishing, others stripping the story to its raw grief, but always circling back to the same haunting image. A baby dressed in lace, posed to look alive, eyes painted open, forever caught between sleep and death dot. And so the question lingers. Was the Whitfield photograph merely a relic of mourning culture, unsettling only to modern eyes? Or did it, as generations of whispers suggest, capture more than a likeness? Did it imprison something that should never have been held? More than a century later, no answer has silenced the debate. The boy in the photograph still gazes outward, and those who look too long sometimes feel, as Thomas once did, that the child is not simply preserved, but watching got the story of the Whitfields and of the baby who seemed to sleep in death reminds us of a truth the Victorians understood all too well. Grief leaves us reaching, grasping for anything that might soften the finality of loss. For them, post-mortem photography was not morbid curiosity, but an act of devotion. Each photograph was a plea against forgetting, a fragile attempt to hold on to love even as time threatened to erase it. And yet, the Whitfield story reveals how easily comfort can slide into torment. What began as Eleanor's act of love became her undoing. Instead of easing grief, the photograph deepened it, transforming her home into a shrine and her life into a vigil. Thomas, unable to reconcile his wife's devotion with his own dread, drifted away. Their children grew up not only haunted by death, but by the photograph itself, a silent reminder that the past refused to rest. We, too, wrestle with the same impulses, though our tools have changed. Where the Victorians turned to photography, we turn to digital memorials, online tributes, even emerging technologies that recreate the likeness and voices of those we've lost. The instinct is the same: to capture, to preserve, to resist the finality of death. But the question remains, at what cost? When does remembrance become obsession? When does memory become haunting? Perhaps that is why the legend of Samuel Whitfield endures. It is not simply the eerie photograph, nor the whispers of cries in the night, but the recognition of something uncomfortably human, the refusal to let go. We see in Eleanor's vigil a reflection of ourselves, our own longing to freeze time, to hold on when the world demands we release. And in Thomas's dread, we glimpse the other side of grief, the fear that our attempts to preserve might bind us to sorrow rather than free us from it. Whether or not the photograph carried anything supernatural may never be known. Historians will continue to debate, skeptics will dismiss, and believers will whisper of souls trapped in glass. But in truth, the deeper mystery lies not in the image itself, but in the human heart that clung to it. We are the ones who give such objects power, who feed them with memory, longing, and fear. So perhaps the real lesson of the Whitfields is this: love and grief are inseparable, and in our struggle to honor the first, we must beware of becoming prisoners of the second. For some doors, once opened, cannot be closed, not by prayer, not by time, not by fire. And now I turn to you. What do you see when you look at the photograph of a child preserved in death? A relic of mourning culture? A window into something beyond? Or a mirror reflecting our own desperate need to hold on? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I want to hear your interpretation. If this story chilled you, if it made you think differently about memory and mourning, don't forget to subscribe for more forgotten horrors from the shadows of history. tap the bell icon so you never miss the next tale. And if you know someone who would be unsettled or perhaps fascinated by the story of Samuel Whitfield, share this video with them. For in the end, stories like these live on only because we keep them alive. The baby who slept in death is long gone, yet his image still gazes outward, waiting for us to look back.